So I guess please join us. Connie, Helen, Ron, and Wyatt. So my goal is going to be ask a question and then listen. So I'm pretty excited for this top-notch panel, covering a couple of different areas around what's been discussed already. Some great presentations from Yin and Christopher. And so why don't we start out with each of you kind of introducing yourselves, personal and professional background, global exposure, experience. Do you have a specific geographical emphasis?
Hey, my name is Wyatt. I'm the head of product currently at Pantreon. Just started 10 days ago. I think my career falls into 3 buckets. Bucket 1, I was a DJ, musician, person who traveled the world playing in nightclubs and that kind of thing all throughout the 90s. Chapter 1. Chapter 2, I started a company called Beatport in 2001, which was a marketplace for electronic music. It was a global marketplace. And the next big chapter was Shutterstock, where I was the head of product and took that company public, and where I really learned internationalization, I think, at a deeper level. It was 27 languages, roughly, and different pricing models in 20 countries globally, and different search indexes, and it was a really complex international product that I got to cover on. So happy to share stories about that.
Hi everybody, my name is Connie Wu, and I've been at DocuSign for almost 4 years now. I started my career in consulting, strategy consulting, and then pretty quickly realized that consulting wasn't the right track for me. I didn't want to be on the outside, I wanted to be in the inside, building a company. So I quit my job and moved out to China to join this 20-person startup company. I was in my early 20s, didn't know what I was doing, but it just sounded really cool. And I remember talking to the CEO, and I was like, well, I don't have a whole lot of skills, but what do you want me to do? I can probably put together a pretty nice PowerPoint for you. And he said, you know what, just pick up the phone and call customer. And that's where I started. I was sort of a combination of biz dev, account manager, sales, whatever was needed to be done, I went and did. And so the startup, unfortunately, didn't survive the economic downturn. And so I went back to school, and then afterwards, I landed at PayPal doing business development. Then, eventually found my way here to DocuSign. And my international background, besides China, is all of my deals. Fortunately, have been pretty global. I've worked with companies like Google, Apple, IBM, Samsung, LG. So a number of these global companies. A lot of our go-to-market is global. So I'm happy to share whatever you guys want to know here.
Great. So thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to speak today. My name is Piovesan. I'm a senior director of business development at Okta. Been there for about 2 years. I guess my global story is initially from Canada. Yeah. And we do know each other, but that's not because all Canadians know each other. So if you come up to me and ask me about your Canadian friend, actually I may know. So from there, went to Europe, studied and worked in Europe for a few years in sort of like PR, marketing, communications. Became intimately acquainted with the fact that there's no such thing as Europe, and yes, they do speak multiple languages. Just because you're based in the UK does not mean that stuff's going to happen for you in Italy, which came as a shock, actually. And then from there, got transferred here to San Francisco. Had the opportunity to work at Cisco and Firefox, doing a lot of their global BD deals. So did some equity investments in Latin America, in the Middle East, and then worked with Firefox for a while as we were trying to build our own phone, which, how many people have heard of the Firefox phone? Thank you, I really appreciate it. It had its moment, it was fun, and we expanded into Latin America, Europe, Eastern Europe, and then from there, kind of moved to Okta, where basically my international expansion is like Sunita.
Hi everyone, I'm Helen Dixon. I'm a director at Thornton, the accounting firm. In terms of sort of background, as you can tell from the accent, I'm from the UK originally, and I actually moved to San Francisco in September this year, so I'm relatively new to town. Prior to doing what I do now, I've done a variety of things. I've been an integration and separation consultant at a consulting firm based in the UK, worked on a deal in Italy, separating out. It's an interesting time. I've also been in-house doing financial planning analysis and sort of commercial projects at a company that was owned by the Men's Warehouse, based in the UK. So, but the majority of my career, apart from maybe that little bit of time out in the industry, I've been focused on supporting clients with transactions at Thornton. I'm a due diligence specialist, so all the, I was enjoying all the things Christopher was talking about in his last presentation around doing your due diligence. So I work with clients who are buying or selling, primarily buying, so they could be privately owned companies, private equity backed, or also listed companies who are either floating on one of the stock exchanges, particularly the UK's AIM. That's something I've done a lot of. And buying build strategy. You can buy several businesses, multiple businesses a year, or it could be the first deal that they've ever done. And I enjoy the diversity of working with people who either experienced deal doers, who know what they want and an extra pair of hands to achieve it, or those who really just don't know how to start and need some advice and sample. Across all sectors, enjoying getting to know all the technology businesses who are out there.
All right, I think you guys are going to hit the questions out of the park. It sounds like basically we have everything from small to large companies, marketing, product, partnerships, and we're going to basically be going in through kind of a round from geo to product, business model, ideal partners, culture, different size partners, supports, complications, and then we'll round it out with advice, and we'll have Q&A. We'll have about 20 minutes of Q&A. Christopher will also be joining us for that portion. So to start it out, how do your teams or clients decide which geographic area to target in terms of like BD, CD, partnership? And how do you prioritize when there are lots of competing geographies and resources? We didn't decide in order, so if you want to pick, or whoever feels most comfortable starting now.
So it's going to depend on the client and
Right.
what they're looking to achieve. So I'm talking from an advisor perspective working with clients. So if you've never done a deal before, don't go for one of the ones in Brazil. Go for something that's firstly small and secondly in close proximity in terms of culture. Hopefully, ideally, you've done a deal in your home country already, so you kind of know about the deal process. And if you're looking for an English speaking, then you've got a few options there.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're looking at I almost like the questions backwards. It isn't like where do you start, which geography. It is what is the and I think this very much goes to something that I think Ian was talking about. What is the corporate strategy first, right? And then that would dictate where you're going to go next. Like I made kind of an offhand remark about Firefox. But I think that's a good example. So at the time, this was about 7 years ago or 5 years ago. Firefox was the browser was trying to launch basically the phone equivalent of a Chromebook, right? It was just a phone with a browser on it, and the process that we went through, which I think was sound. I mean, even though ultimately, unfortunately, it didn't work out, but I think the process was sound. Was we thought, well, iPhone is doing super well in North America and in Western Europe, more affluent regions. Android still hadn't quite picked up. It hadn't reached kind of where it is now. So we thought, we have a really good opportunity to come in with a low-cost handset because the hardware itself would be cheap because it's just running a browser basically. And so why don't we start targeting some of the more higher end of the emerging markets? So that's why we targeted places like Brazil. We targeted places like Chile, so those are some of the early markets there because we thought that those had probably the best demographics It was still an emerging market, so still a price-sensitive market, but more on the higher end. That they would probably want like a phone that has some additional features and functionality to it, and probably had the infrastructure to support it because you needed some pretty good connection. So that's really what drove our international expansion. Was like at the time was a pretty sound understanding of who we wanted our customer to be, and where did that customer live, and then everything kind of followed on from that.
That's really comforting to hear, because I mean, in previous panels that we've done where we talk about like what is the strategy for expanding to new geos, one example was Airbnb, and all that the person who was heading up international knew was win China. There really wasn't a strategy in place. And that's kind of like surprising to hear in some ways, because it's a large company, it's a lot of traction, a lot of smart people, but like coming down to the actual due diligence and strategy side, some companies just really don't have a good idea of like where to go next. And obviously, probably if your customers are asking to go there, it's a pretty good indication. But
the way we defined, I don't know if we're going to order, I just jumped in. The way we defined, but I'll say the product to optimize, the way we defined our core customer set was through their ad spend. So people that spend a certain amount of dollar on paid advertising care deeply about whether they want to A/B test the performance of the advertising, and that's sort of the core, one of the big definers of that customer segment. And so you could look at different countries and line up all the companies, and you could figure out their ad spend, and then you could kind of size like the size of prize, and that helped us define our international strategy. And it pulled us into places like Brazil, where ad spend is on the rise, and of course a big chunk of Europe and Japan. So that was Optimizely. And then contrasting that, as a startup, like recently I hired, these little competitors pop up and just copy what we do. And with Hired, there was at least 10 of them who just became a Hired marketplace in their local market and tried to copy exactly what we were doing. And so you have to decide for yourself, am I going to let them grow and get some traction in the market, or are we going to immediately enter it or buy them? We bought the French version of Hired. We bought the Sydney version of Hired, and then a few other markets we just localized and rolled in and took the market because we felt like we could. So those are two different vectors for how we strategically chose territories.
So I think everybody here covered everything. I think with DocuSign, the way that we think about expansion, I think the likeness, proximity to your home country is really important, because given the legality around signature, so we think about the world in sort of two, broadly speaking, sort of two buckets, right? We have common law countries and civil law countries. I'll spare you the gory details, but if you think about the countries that are most similar to us, right? The UK, Canada, Australia, they're English speaking, their regulatory environment is similar, the legal environment is similar. So when you're entering these markets, you don't have to do a lot of customization, right? First thing you don't have to do is you don't have to localize your product to the language, because everybody speaks English. And that makes it a lot easier. And the way that you're doing business there, culturally, there's a lot of similarity already, so you can enter in more easily. The other strategy that I use, so those are sort of like the table stakes that, when I sit down with my partner and say, okay, do we have all those sort of check boxes checked? And then we kind of say, well, let's do trade, let's trade, right? There are countries where I'm stronger in, and there are countries where you're stronger in. So let's figure out, how can you help me and how can I help you? And so you can sort of pick and choose, like, hey, I really want to enter the Japan market, but I'm not so weak, I'm not so strong in that particular region because I don't have the people, I don't know the lay of the land, but you're pretty strong. How can you help us there? And you can say, look, I'm also really strong in North America, or this particular sector, and this is how I can help you. So try to also use your partners and figure out where their strengths are, and do, and I mean, that's the crux of the partnership, right? Is how can I help you fill in your gaps, and how can they help, how can I help you, how can they help me, right, type of thing. So you want to understand your partner's business just as well, and really rely on them to kind of help you, in areas that you actually need help, so.
And that kind of brings up the whole next idea of like, how do you create a win-win partnership and acquisition? Especially when maybe the partners are vastly different sizes. So in my business, what we find is like clients will be like, oh, a SoftBank really wants to work with us, or oh, this large telco wants to work with us. But they're really conflicted because while they may have the big name recognition, they might not get the love that they really need, especially from a startup perspective. Like they have very little leverage. They're just excited about some big, well-known company wanting to partner with them. But how do you guys decide, and how do you kind of create that win-win situation?
Yeah, so I can start.
If you don't tell us who's going to talk, we're just going to sit
Yeah,
there.
maybe you.
Maybe I will.
It's a plug bunch.
Yeah,
Connie, it is.
I know.
So how do you, yeah, so, you know, I think that, I mean, I've been in conversations with when a partner, a very large software, you know, solutions provider, basically said, look, we're not even going to look your way unless it's like $100 million business. And in the back of my head, I was thinking, that is like literally, you know, I mean, I'm not talking specifically about DocuSign or anything, but like, we don't make that much money. I mean, like that's a huge amount, right? So you're thinking, well, how can I even bring my team and all the resources together to hit that number? And I think it's important to sit down with your partner and break that revenue down into manageable chunks, right? You want to ask the right questions around, where is this coming from? Is this one product line? Is this multiple product line? Is this one region? Over what period of time? So I think that sometimes large partners like to throw out big numbers because, I mean, that's really their success metric. And so you want to understand that, but be able to say, look, let's work together and get there, right? We have to really carve out the partnership in phases. And I think some of the things you want to look for as the early win is extremely important. Sometimes even, you know, we're talking about shiny objects in partnerships. A lot of times we're like, let's go after the big stuff, the shiny big stuff that's going to be like amazing, the cool stuff. Those things don't make money, and they're very hard. They're very hard to achieve. You want to go after a lot of times the kind of the unsexy things, the stuff that's just kind of there, but it's working. People are not paying attention, but you know it's making money. And it's easy win. And once you get the easy win, the win will sell itself. Because one of the challenges working with big companies is getting their attention. Then you may have them for like, you know, the time when you're signing a contract, they're all over you. And then, you know, a quarter or two later, you're like, hello, where is everybody, right? Because they're on to the next big thing. So you've got to get that early win and use that as your true beachhead into that partnership and market the hell out of that win and say, this is what we can accomplish if we work together. So let's talk about phase 2.
Yeah, I would also just kind of building on that. Certainly getting the early win for sure, and I think that's just not global partnerships, that's just partnerships in general. Also just making sure that the team you're working with is aligned with your interests and the interests of your company. One thing that is particularly in the Bay Area, where pretty much every single large telecom, bank, utility company, retailer from every single part of the world has their innovation center here in Silicon Valley. And they're like, oh yeah, what we do is we mine all the Silicon Valley innovation and then we send it off to headquarters in whatever part of the world to help our utility, you know, work better. And then they come to you like, hey, you know, we can help you get 99% of whatever country because we own that because we're the monopoly utility in that country. And obviously that does not work. And that's like, that's a fiction. And it can burn up a lot of cycles when you're trying to go global, thinking that if you work with the local innovation center, that they're going to help you succeed in that other country, because the teams aren't aligned, right? They've been sent here because some board member said you need an innovation center, and they just plopped a bunch of people here. But really, that they have no pull with the headquarters in the country that you're trying to succeed in. So I think you know, making sure that you know you do your diligence, not just on the business case and the wins and how you're going to make money, but on the team that you're dealing with internally within the company. Do they have the right, you know, do they have the ability to execute on what you may, you know, whatever piece of paper you may sign? Because I think what you find is that you spend a lot of time dealing with some team where they're metric on signing pieces of paper, and then they move on to their next bright shiny object, and they just hand that piece of paper to somebody internally who wasn't involved with the piece of paper signing and therefore has no interest in making you succeed.
A lot of partnerships internationally I've worked on. I was fortunate enough to be on the side where we had really robust technology that was well documented and service oriented and had an API. And a few deals I've done were with smaller organizations where we could offer them a giant chunk of our technology stack that would make everything they do a lot faster and better and smoother. For example, when we acquired the French version of Hired, it was a 15-person team that was great hustlers. They had like a website that did a few of the things, but we were like, well, we have a 25-person data science team, and we have all these algorithms that do highly intelligent matching, and if you just take your data set and you apply it to our engine, we can make your business a lot bigger, a lot faster. So I think I've had some success doing technology partnerships like those. The same with Shutterstock. When we went into Japan, we needed help with content, but we had the bigger, more robust technology engine. In that case specifically, we had a search engine that was well API'd and could be applied to any set of images regardless of the language or regardless of the territory. And so when we did a partnership in this case, not an acquisition, and in the partnership, we offered, like, they could have fewer engineers and technologists working on that part of the stack, and we could plug our APIs into their content stream to create a search engine for their developers.
So Chris went over some of the risks that you may find when kind of expanding internationally, specifically through M&A, but I think this question kind of relates to both partnerships and M&As. But I'll start with Helen. There we go. What are some of the biggest issues that people don't foresee or can really kind of ruin a partnership or an acquisition?
So it's on a similar theme, not surprisingly, as a theme Christopher's talked about. So failing to plan your acquisition integration, you get excited about the deal, you've got a deal team who are incentivized on getting the acquisition done, get it signed, great, but it's well known that 2/3 of all acquisitions fail to create value, and sometimes they destroy value in the business, the core business. So you really don't want to be in that situation. So focus, dedicate the right resources to the integration, and don't underestimate how long it'll take.
An integration manager is such a simple concept, but very few companies do it, or a lot of times it's the person who does the deal that's supposed to sort of be the integration manager, but then they get pulled into other deals and they're not actually managing the integration. And I think just having a dedicated person there who's gold on how the integration is performing is, I found, really helpful. The other thing I've never been able to do successfully is make a lot of change to an acquisition. Like if we meet someone and we're like, we have these grand plans of a lot of changes in a short amount of time, I've always fucked that up. So I don't recommend that path.
And traditionally, in those kinds of changes, are you looking to change the product or the business model also, or is it more just?
Yeah, like for example, Shutterstock was a subscription business, and we would meet a lot of businesses that they were an image library with a search engine, but they were credit-based or some other pricing model. And it kind of seemed like it should work, but when you lift the hood, you find like their entire accounting systems and like everything is just fundamentally different because they're trying to attract a customer to buy a single image, and we're trying to attract a customer who's going to be with us for 4 years on a subscription. And so it seems like it should fit, but it didn't work at all because the way people operated and the way they thought about the business was too fundamentally different. And our thought was like, oh yeah, we'll just like acquire you and change it to a subscription, and then we'll be off to the races. But then like the change it to a subscription part turned out to be 2 years long instead of like 2 months long. Because it's fundamentally different. Like, obtaining customers and then keeping them as a recurring paying customer for a long period of time is a different art and science than selling one-off items.
Is that, I'll just ask you a question, is that also just a function of not only understanding the business that you are going to acquire a partnership, but understanding their customer? Because we are increasingly getting used to a subscription business, but perhaps in other markets where your target may exist, the subscription business doesn't exist. They just, the consumer or the customer is used to, a license model or some other model.
This particular case was a U.S. transaction. It wasn't actually international, so I guess it's a little weird. We did on that in particular when we went into other markets, especially in Europe. We found we had that struggle exactly. Like a subscription business seems really cool and interesting in the United States, but when we went into Germany, it was like a bad word. And none of the Germans would hit the pricing page and convert it like 20% of what we would see in the United States using the same language translated. So I think that's what.
Right.
I've struggled with that in localization and expansion.
Yeah. How quickly did you realize that? And did you make the changes needed to the business model then?
We changed our business in Germany. We led with packs, and subscription was sort of we would upsell them into subscriptions like after a period of time of making purchases. So we had to kind of flip the business to be successful in Germany based on the US version.
One risk that and I don't have an answer for it, but this was at one of my previous companies. We worked with a large consumer electronics company in Asia, and we knew that it's one of those situations where it's kind of a frenemy relationship. Like we need them, they're big, we need them, but we know that they have their own ambitions, and part of our thinking is, well, you got to keep your friends close and enemies closer, right? And so, I don't mean to call any of my partners enemies. They're not. So they're wonderful people and companies. But it's a risk, right? And you know that when you have companies that are out there, you know that they want to do the right thing for themselves. How do you protect the IP? And so in the deal that we did, we lawyered up. We absolutely had lots of attorneys reviewing every little detail, making sure that the IP was protected, and this is where you really have to work with your legal team. But I think it's a business risk. At the end of the day, you know that when you're doing business globally, you're going to run into these situations. Like I said, I don't have an answer, but I think having, like you said, having someone close by, maintaining that relationship, keeping that thread, kind of trying to understand what's happening, it helps, right? Because once they establish the relationship, your partner, if they're really trying to copy your technology or whatever, they almost kind of feel like, wow, like I'm kind of cheating on my partner, especially if you've got somebody working very closely with them. But I just want to say that that's one thing that I've seen. Just be aware that this is going to happen, and at the end of the day, it is a business risk that you need to factor in.
If I could piggyback, I have so many scars from China. I mean, I don't. If anyone can tell me how to enter China successfully, I'd love to chat with you after this. But I've gone into China a few times trying to make a partnership. We tried to go in ourselves, then we got shut down by the Great Firewall of China, and then we would go in and meet with other companies and try to acquire them, and then get shut down for regulatory reasons. And then we would try to do a JV. And we try to figure out, it's like your brand, what does that mean? And like, this is the same thing as we do. And it's actually started a JV in China when I was at Shutterstock. And then that fell apart pretty quickly because they just wanted to understand how our business worked. We really didn't, they weren't really wedded to the partnership the way we were. I've got a lot of scar tissue on that. If anyone has any recommendations though.
Yeah, in one of my business meetings in China, the partner literally said, "Why don't you just show us your code?" And we're like, whoa. So we got out of that one pretty quickly. So.
Any better stories than that?
Firefox was open source, so we showed everybody code. Yeah, I know. There you go.
China is definitely one of the harder questions. I feel like anybody you talk to has some sort of horror story. More failures than successes. I'm going to kind of segue a little bit into what Yin brought up a little bit. of how a company expands to new markets from the perspective of, all right, sending out one top salesperson, hiring one local person, potentially hiring a consulting firm, going all in with a country manager. Any thoughts on like some methods that have worked for you, or also, we're all fans of horror stories also. And I guess we will start with, this is fun for me, Ron?
I mean, I think when you move into a new geography, I almost think by definition you need to take somebody from the company and ship them over there for a while. And the reason is that you basically you're taking your company, the culture, the priorities, the imperatives, like everything that the company holds dear, and you're basically trying to replicate that in another location. And even if you hire somebody, like even when you're hiring in the U.S., that new person still takes 3, 6, 9 months to fully become integrated into the company and understand how it works and have relationships and understand the culture. So imagine how much more difficult that is if that person is both new to the company as well as in a different time zone and a different, and may also speak a different language. So while it does maybe sound somewhat colonial, I do think you do need to take somebody who understands your company really well, put them in country, and have them grow the team, and then basically hire and groom their replacement that may take a 2-year transition or something like that.
Nothing to add. I mean, I think that's very summary.
Is that somebody from the team?
Yeah.
I like the Tiger team. I agree. That's and I've failed on the country manager one once. That was at Hired. We kind of had like 8 or 9 country managers all within 6 to 8 months, ready to go attack. And they each wanted to kind of build out these big orgs, and it would have been. We got, I think, 2 of them succeeded, and like maybe 6 or so failed. And so it was sort of I wish we had a more organic kind of small team that didn't already have like an executive leader that wanted to immediately go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 2 days. It would have been nice to have grown that a bit, one at a time, more organically.
All right. One other question about kind of when you expanded, have you had from top down everybody involved? And if not, how has that affected the expansion plans?
I mean, you do need, you do need everybody involved. I think with again, I'll refer back to Firefox. It came, there was some competing interest over how do we expand internationally, and then finally, to its credit, the CEO at the time just said, no, like this is what we're doing. This is no longer democracy. These are the countries we're going after, and I think that just created focus. And then similarly, with another company that I worked with, Hearsay, we expanded into Asia, and we spent a lot of time trying to understand Asia, right? And I think Talia's point that you started out with, I think, is excellent. You don't expand globally; you expand locally, dozens and dozens and dozens of times. So, in our attempt to understand Asia, it was really our attempt to understand which is the first country within Asia we will execute, and do we understand the idiosyncrasies of that country well enough that we could possibly execute. And then that's when you do get some interesting discussion, because in the case of Hearsay, it was kind of a debate between do we go first into Hong Kong or first into Singapore, and that actually was a bit of a debate, which I'm sure I think probably a lot of American companies, when they think about Asia, have that debate, assuming that they're kind of Australia's a separate issue. So that was an active debate, and people had active ideas, but eventually we had to all settle and say, okay, this is the plan, and we're going to go after it, and we just basically chose a country and went after it.
I think we need that leadership, sponsorship, and accountability through the chain. So if you don't have senior level management and the board involved, then ultimately the deal might not get done because of a lack of focus and sort of permission almost. And I'd say it works the other way around as well, that if you've got a team of people working on getting a deal done and it's not really going the way you kind of expected, everyone's just working on it because they've got a plan and process and yeah, this is what we're doing. You might actually need, you know, people further up the organisation to turn around and say, actually guys, should we be doing this now? And be prepared to pull the plug on it. I don't think we can do that without that authority. It doesn't have to be the top. It depends on the size of the organisation, doesn't it? But you know, the right people.
I'm also intrigued from your perspective. Like here, most of the conversations are like U.S.-based companies expanding. How has it changed when maybe it's a UK company or another company looking at the acquisition or looking at kind of expansion? Because I mean, I feel like from the USA, especially from here, we're number one. Like we're used to being top of the world, and especially we're talking about a lot of tech also. So.
Yeah. I don't see as many UK companies looking to expand into the US. The sort of, you know, I know talked about having common language and things like that, but actually geographically, Europe is still, or we'll see what happens with Brexit, but Europe is still, you know, closest proximity. So the clients that I've worked with have either been, well, when I was based in the UK, I had US clients buying things in UK and Europe, but most of the people I dealt with were either European corporates and private equity by UK businesses, or the other way around. And mainly it's the kind of countries that you'd expect, so France, Germany, and some deals in Italy and Spain. So I suppose they're dealing up front with the fact that you've got pretty different cultures and pretty different, very different languages, and you know, they're having to manage around that process. I think, you know, it's interesting. You know, some of the deals, yeah, half of the deals I work on don't happen. Sometimes that's because of something I've uncovered, and other times it's just some other reason. And one of those is a German private equity looking to buy a business in the UK, and it's just culturally they just I think ultimately the British management team thought, I don't really want to be. No, yeah, the German guys were my client, and I really liked them, but just sort of think work with them on a daily basis. And
I was just going to say.
So are you saying that despite everything like the internet and all that, and that destroyed like time and space and all that, you're still saying that geographic proximity, when thinking about a partnership or a deal, at least in Europe, geographic proximity trumps things like similar language or similar legal system or similar, you know, culture to some extent?
I think it probably varies by sector. So one of the clients that I did a lot with was a UK listed business in the pharmaceutical sector. So medium sized, not big pharma. And they did exactly what you said in the previous question. So they're a UK company. They had partnership agreements in Europe for their products. They wanted to make acquisitions in Europe, and most of what they did was in the UK. And they had sort of head of country who was basically in France. It took them years to find an acquisition in France that really did what they wanted, you know, and ticked all the boxes, because they had quite a, you know, rigorous bid, no bid, go, no go process, which is interesting in itself. So they'd specifically chosen that, I suppose from a pharmaceutical point of view. They sold drugs into the US, but through partners, and then it's quite difficult to make sure you get the regulatory approval out here.
Can I ask a question? Because you mentioned that we're all familiar with 2/3 of the deals aren't successful. Did you see a higher success rate in the UK versus the US? Because maybe you sort of said this proximity. Did you see a difference in success?
The 2/3 is in reference to sort of the success of the value creation after the deal. So I couldn't really place
that.
in there.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I have a lot of companies in the Valley, they kind of came up through this MVP-ish style of like, let's just try some stuff and see if it works, and they mostly sell to a bunch of people around them. So that was the case of both Optimizing and Hires. I saw that twice. They're like, hey, we made a thing, and like it turns out other tech companies down the block want this thing, and next thing they know they have a Series C, and But you know, they grew up a certain way, and then to move into another country is like a net new, completely foreign, like not just the country's foreign, but like they haven't even yet considered what it might take for the product to work somewhere else. And I think it's got to be most, or like more than half of tech companies in the Valley kind of come up that way. And then juxtaposing that, Shutterstock was really interesting because the founding story, John started a website and put his own photos up there because he was doing email marketing back in 2002, and he was sending a bunch of emails, and he had to go to Getty, and it would be like $500 for an image. And he's like, okay, well, I just need like 30 crappy images just to send these emails out. I want one beautiful Getty image. So he went and took a bunch of photos himself, and he made a subscription to it, and people came and they bought a subscription. And then he went, oh, I need more photographers. And the US photographers were like, well, we're not going to sell our images for cheap. And so he's like, And he built, and so he goes, well, I bet the Russians would. And so he translated it for him into Russian. And you know, the ruble at the time and the dollar were in such disparity that he was making a lot of Russian photographers a lot of money. So Shutterstock's image library is, to this day, probably 40% Russian. But all
that being investigated, is it?
And so I think it's really interesting because Shutterstock was sort of international from day one. Like it was part of the founding story was, well, in order to make the business work, it needs to work across a bunch of different countries. And so even by year 4, Shutterstock was in like 9 languages. And so it never had to be like, oh, we need the whole executive team to buy in. It was just like a part of the DNA. And so you didn't have to force it as much. It was just a thing. It was just, and then each territory that we looked at, we had to become partners with local photographers because the imagery that they would shoot is so unique and different. For example, I'll give you one really interesting thing that I learned. I spent a month in Tokyo learning about how Tokyo photographers take photos versus the US. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, like the nail that sticks out will get hammered down, that famous Japanese phrase. What that means is people, they don't like people that stand out and are unique, you know what I mean? That's sort of a part of that culture. And the photos are the same way. So if you take a photo of a building, a US photographer would maybe take it from the bottom, like looking up, and it would make the building seem really big. And like it would make the building stand out. And so if you were looking for a building in Japan, a Japanese person would say, well, that's not a Japanese photographer. A Japanese photographer would never shoot it from that angle. The Japanese photographer would shoot it straight on so it looked in line with every other building and not taller or bigger. Yes, and so when we would study the Japanese market, we would learn that they wouldn't buy any of the photos that were taken by the Russians. Even though they seem like totally regular buildings, that you're like, these are good buildings, why would you buy these buildings? And they would say, well, that's clearly not someone local who's taking that shot, and I need to do, my marketing needs to be local, it needs to be interesting. So that's sort of an example. It was fun to work at that company because it was born and the DNA of the organization was global and localized from an early stage.
Make sure there's no hidden code in the Russian.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of jokes you can go.
Yeah, I had to stop myself.
So we're running out of time, and I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. But before we do that, before we have Christopher come up here, we've heard advice in sing-song format from Ian, which was pretty amazing, by the way.
That was incredible.
Wow. And then Christopher's presentation. What kind of key pieces of advice would you give if somebody's looking to expand globally? And I will start with whoever looks me in the eye.
One piece of advice would be to take advice, and I'm not just saying that as an advisor, but obviously talk to me when I talk about that. Get a lawyer who doesn't, it's not your divorce lawyer, it's a lawyer that understands M&A and deals in that country that you're going into, and most importantly, probably than us advisors, is speech people who've done it before, who've been there, done that. They're the ones with the real first-hand war stories, so that would be my top tip.
Just go down the line, I guess.
Actually, I would. actually going to repeat what Talia said. I think that the only global advice is that there's no such thing as global, and just understand that if you're going to move outside, heck, if you're going to move outside Silicon Valley and go to the Midwest, I mean that's a different planet too. So it is. You're not going global. You're going in a country, and then another country, and then another country, and understand what is unique about that country that's of interest to your business, and what can your business provide that would be unique in that country. And it may not just be just replicating your business model here over and over again.
I would say I'm a little bit more morbid, I guess. You know, I think when you go global, each place you go, you're almost, it's like starting a brand new business almost, right? You have to, you know, do your day job is, you know, thinking about how do you conquer the world, and then in the afternoon you're negotiating with the building owner to turn the AC up or down, whatever it is, right? So everything you have to kind of sort out and building literally from scratch. And oftentimes, especially when you're a small company, you don't have a whole lot of resources, you're going somewhere, you're going to find yourself in a hole. And I think the question is, a very hard question is, do you keep digging or do you get out? And it's not a simple answer. There's so many factors. And I think sometimes sometimes one of the lessons I've learned in my career is everyone says persistence and, you know, passion, all that is very hard to accomplish. You just got to keep going. But sometimes letting go is even harder. And I've certainly worked for somebody who failed because he didn't let go in time. He didn't pivot in time because he kept going and kept going, and we missed the market. And so I think a lot of times you have to kind of reach inside yourself too and say, you know, is this the right game for me? Is this the right time for me? Do I walk away? And it's a very, very hard question. So that's one lesson that I got.
I feel I've had the most success going into new markets with a person on the ground who's familiar, oftentimes with partners, even if it's just like a person who you do marketing partnerships with, but they have a building and you get to take some office space in that building, and the people that you put there have like another company to chat with about stuff. I've done that in Germany and France a few times, even though it wasn't a JV, it wasn't an acquisition, it was just, instead of us having our own office, let's be in a spot with some like-minded people who are in a similar business. So people on the ground are imperative, I think, for international expansion who are from that area.
Very good. So now I guess, Christopher, you can have my seat. Thanks. And we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Anybody? Anybody? Talia?
I just wanted actually to add a comment to the win-win situation, and to kind of follow up on what you said. So, and also to what you said about China, because you can succeed in China. It is possible. So when we entered China, we created an obstacle with mobile app, Chitu, and this was our entry point into China and the success. But the win-win situation we did with partnerships is, WeChat integration. We played on the offering of, WeChat is huge in China, so we needed them in order to have market penetration, and really just the address book import with WeChat integration and entry point during onboarding. For us, this was way above and beyond any other optimization enhancement we could have done. This was the single thing that really lifted our growth in the country. But what could we offer them, right? And so the win-win, and it was a very very intense negotiation. But the win-win, I think, for a lot of companies, especially for US going outbound, is the local versus global. So a lot of time, we, as a US company, I was coming from the outside to the local market. You don't have the market adoption, the brand presence in country. But you do have the global market share, right? So we could offer WeChat at the global market share because they didn't yet have footprint outside China as LinkedIn did. And then similarly, with several months ago we did we were negotiating partnership with Line actually for us. This was an interesting example where the win-win situation came from, we wanted them in order to, have some presence in Southeast, in Asia, in Korea, and South Korea, and Japan, and other Asian countries. But for them, it was more, if we build something, in other words, if ServerMonkey was able to build certain features that they were interested in, like events, if ServerMonkey had an events component, then that would be relevant for them. So we actually were working on building new features to accommodate a gap that they needed in return for something that we needed from them, like social media and distribution channel. So.
Actually, I really like that point because I think it plays into one of your earlier questions about like getting alignment, and I think so. I made the reference of hearsay, and we attempted to expand into Asia, and to be honest, it didn't work out that well. And I think part of the problem was we had alignment strategically, but there wasn't like this notion of that we needed almost like to align the product with the region, and this willingness to change the product, or like you just said, create something new that makes the product newly relevant in the region. And for some reason, we just couldn't get that done. And I think that was, you have to walk in very clear-eyed saying, look, the market dynamics may be there, but we also have to be willing to modify the product or create something new that would make us newly relevant in that region.
And that takes a ton of resources, right? If you're going to change the actual product or the value proposition.
Totally, yeah.
You're almost taking a break from another, like maybe even your home location. So, any other?
Yeah, I'm wondering, because when I used to do alliance strategy, one of the milestones that we would suggest to ourselves was that M&A is the very last thing, right? It's almost the finishing line. So we would date forever. You start out with one promotion, maybe you do co-product development, co-licensing. As things go along and you trust each other and you start to learn about each other's markets, you develop an alliance strategy. And maybe the M&A, in my case, the M&A was always very organic. It came to a point where the partner or the target had nowhere else to go. And they gladly accepted the offer because maybe 6 years down the line, that was the right thing to do. It's almost like, you've been dating this person for 6 years and maybe this is the time to do it. So there's more mutuality, and I wonder, maybe because we're living in the world of the internet, things just happen a lot faster. But I'm just wondering if you have that perspective and if you have that kind of checklist when you're doing things and looking at companies. Can anyone speak to that?
I'll say that, well, I'll speak to the opposite of it, which is just quite a few startups I've been with. There was a competitor that's just a straight up copycat. And it's, you only have a few options in that. It's like you're either going to give the market up and decide like how late can we wait to do something about it, or are we going to acquire them, or are we going to build? And I feel like at least, maybe it's because we had investors and we raised money, but it felt like there wasn't time to date that we needed to make a decision about and then the opportunity cost of that decision might be losing the market. And so in that scenario, we couldn't wait much.
Sometimes it sounds like it's Silicon Valley and then DC pressure.
I wouldn't discount that.
I think that is completely different as you go, like, I don't know, I've seen like completely different deals done in the East Coast as opposed to here. Not because it's like, maybe it's the weather. Like thinking will like take much longer, whereas here it's like people are like chasing the opportunity, and sometimes decisions are made like around like a late meeting saying, okay, we're going with that. I don't know if you've seen like the Silicon Valley TV show, but it does feel like some of them they get done like that.
Well, I would say I'm sure, I don't know what the stats are, but I'm sure M&A deals that start with a partnership tend to work out better than ones that probably don't. I'm just making a generalization on my own experience, just for that very same reason, right? You just have a much longer opportunity to get to know. You have a better chance of knowing where the skeletons are hidden and what all the issues of that company are. You can better prepare for them when you actually go get married.
There's also part of it, like, you don't start a company to get acquired necessarily. Like, a lot of companies that are potentially being acquired, are they holding out maybe too long? Or, so Helen, are you, both of you finding that?
I think what we saw a lot of in the UK, and I think it applies here as well, is just that expectation gap around price. So you get a lot of businesses that there's just unrealistic expectations on the seller, and no one's gonna touch it until they come up with a different deal structure, or they just reevaluate their price expectations. It's like climate there, and it's more sort of owner-managed businesses, and actually you might have someone who's in their 70s, and they just don't want to sell their business because they want so much money for it. So I think that does play a role.
Also, I think there are some industries where though you do have people, start companies that are more explicit about actually getting sold. Right? There's a couple of like niche industries. One is this company that I think it's called Stericycle. They go out and collect used needles in different local like doctors' offices. They're like the 800-pound gorilla in the space. They have like 80% market share. But they have this science down where they will, when a small company gets big enough, they will just make an offer and have it down to a science. They know exactly how much they're willing to pay. And then they have a team that will go in and acquire that company. And so my guess is a lot of the companies that get started there have a reasonable expectation that's going to be their exit strategy. They just need to get to a certain size for it to actually happen. I was at a private equity firm and we were in the records management business a couple years ago. So like actually like boxes of paper need to be stored somewhere, right? People still use a lot of paper. I'm on DocuSign now. And so there's the Iron Mountain, where you probably see their trucks go back and forth. They're the 800-pound gorilla. So every records management company, there's a good chance you will get, if you want an exit, you'll probably go get sold to Iron Mountain.
A couple business ideas right there.
Yeah.
Anybody else? I know.
Are any of you, or have you been interested in Cuba? I'm just kind of curious, I mean, given
Every summer.
I'd like to visit.
Given what's going on politically, but also an incredible market. So I'm just kind of curious how, if any of you have been thinking about in the past or in the future, Cuba.
I can't say I have.
Yeah, every time we look at the value metric for our strategy, it's pretty far down the list.
Okay.
Even though it's changing a lot, and it's really interesting. Just from we always think about a coverage, right? We want the biggest market with the highest growth rates, and it never quite.
It's a pretty small market.
It's pretty small.
Yeah,
It's
but it's
pretty-
an interesting market.
It's super interesting.
Yeah.
Same answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think even the internet coverage is pretty spotty still, and we're talking to like a tech panel. So, I mean, we did go visit. I visited about 3 or 4 years ago. What was it? Like 4 years ago. And they still had like dial-up internet. Wherever there was internet in a private home, there was like literally dial-up modems and stuff. So, that's part of the sort of political environment that they don't want that. It's opening up, but by the time they get fast, or the coverage gets fast enough, it's gonna take a while. And right now, I think there's still political uncertainty with what the US government's gonna do. So I also haven't encountered any companies looking into Cuba. It's usually Brazil, Mexico, right? And then, Colombia, things are kind of going really well. And then like Uruguay for like the dairy industry, right? So specifics, but not Cuba yet.
But there's also like certainly volatility. I don't know if that is something that you like factor in terms of like, for instance, like political instability. So that's always been like a concern for some regions.
Are you talking about the Cuban one or the one?
You pick.
Well, there's actually interesting. The World Bank does put out a statistic, and they look at every country, and they do. It's called the attractiveness of doing business in each of the countries. Yeah, so
feeds into our software model.
Right. So they look at a whole bunch of different factors. I don't know if political upheaval is part of it. Potentially, they look at IP laws. They look at other factors that go into how easy it is to do business there. So that's something we looked at DocuSign as well as one of the factors to figure out how to prioritize different regions or countries.
Thank you.
IP law was a big one for us too. I'd been in a music business before and an image business, Shutterstock, and for both countries, respect for copyright law was imperative. narratives. So even like while Russia was a really big market, very rare that like in either of those we went from a consumer perspective into that market very deeply. Because the respect for copyright law is just too different.
A question for you guys who entered international markets. What's your methodology for figuring out what your metric for success is, and also how long you're willing to stay in that market to say, okay, we're going to spend X amount of time and resources to say, okay, we've gotten to this point to say we want to stay, this is a successful outcome, or you know what, this isn't working out, let's go. Because what happens, I think, a lot of times is people spend a lot of time and money and say, you know, we're almost there, we kind of didn't get the last bug, let's hang out for another year, and it keeps going and going and going. And sometimes it's, you kind of look a couple of years back later and say, you know what, if we had a little more discipline about some of the ones, we should have just said, cut our losses, let's go move on to the ones that are going to bear fruit or something else.
That was sort of like what I was sort of alluding to. Is like when you find yourself in a hole, do you keep digging? Do you pour in more resources? Do you pour in sales? One of the lessons that I learned from the company that that didn't do very well, because we ultimately there was a lot of just sort of like an endless amount, like let's just keep going. We'll strike gold at some point. And we really neglected to kind of figure out what were the key metrics that we wanted to do and be insanely diligent about looking at those things. And these are essentially like, can you get the customers, right? How many customers do you have? How much revenue are you making? And what's the level of investment? Is the ROI positive or negative, and is it growing? A lot of these are, the pretty basic type of business metrics, like literally put them on the board, and every single day, review, rinse and repeat, review, rinse and repeat. Like that's what you have to do. And every single month, at the end of the month, and saying, how much money did I spend? And how much did I make? Am I growing at a rate that is satisfactory for me to basically take my earnings and basically double down? I think going through that level of detail and rigor is going to help you make that decision. It's going to give you the clarity that you need to make sort of the next step. So think about going small, don't cast a wide net, going small, get the wins, and then say, what's step 2, and make it very manageable chunks. Yeah.
I would say that the not only the revenue, but the revenue ramp rate was pretty important. Having failed at this once, also hired cast a wide net. It was, I think, somewhere between 10 and 14 markets, kind of all within 6 months or something like that. Like, ready to go. And then having to shut down 6 of those within 18 months was definitely like there's some scar tissue there. And the reason why the decision was made to shut them down was because the ramp rate of the revenue was a few factors slower than the ramp rate of a few other. So when you think about like an investment portfolio like a VC would across a bunch of companies, all you do is looking across a bunch of countries and you're deciding what's the speed at which these investments are going to pay off. So I think of it like a portfolio management job. When you've got 10 or 15 countries that you're ramping, it's a portfolio management gig.
In a weird way, that's actually a good success story for Hired, because
It was fast.
Sorry?
Well, yeah, we failed quickly.
Yeah. Well, no, and I think I think failing quickly is that's important, because I mean you have to know when you're going into a market, you just have to know your metric, whatever it happens to be, whether it's ramp rate or total growth or expected revenue or whatever it happens to be. As long as you know what it is going in to the country and you're very rational about what you think it's going to be, and then if you're not achieving that metric, whatever it happens to be, sure, go through an analysis process and understand why you're not achieving. But then if after 18 months you're not hitting the metric that you think you're going to hit, cut your losses, move on to the next one.
I have a follow-up question for that.
One more question.
One more question. Whatever. Do you want to go ahead? What? Did someone have the question?
Yes.
The question? Go
I
ahead.
had a question about, I love advice about when you enter a market, you've landed and it works, year 1 is you're lucky and you're successful. How do you think about year 2 and your continuous roadmap and getting the right like market to global feedback or finding the right product market fit after you've landed and trying to stay fresh?
When we've, in the past, we think about it like getting revenue to ramp at a certain rate, I wouldn't argue is product market fit. I would argue that's just like, you've managed to discover that the thing that you've already built can be somewhat effective there. But then I think most of the time when I'm in a year two of a new market, that's product market fit year. That means like, all right, well, we made it work, but like, how do we scale it? Like, how do we take it from a thing that isn't failing to a thing that's optimized and contribution margin positive and repeatable? You know what I mean? Like that's what I would define as product market fit. And so that would be what way I think about here too.
I think that to add on to those comments, when we work with customers, we help them first define what are the different stages for your business, right? So what does it mean to be in discovery? So it's just on your radar screen, you're kind of collecting information, but you haven't really invested any resources. The next stage might be an intermediate stage where it's like first win. So we're getting some traction, but we're just dating. Then it becomes development, right? So, okay, now we're building a team, putting resources on the ground, and then finally scale. And for each stage, we help them define what are the activities that you should do when a country is in that stage, and then also what are the triggers that need to be in place for you to promote a country into the next. So you're not just doing that sort of willy-nilly, right? So you have certain metrics defined, certain buckets. Only if that particular KPI is in this range will we promote it. And then once it's in that stage, here's what needs to happen. So we got the whole checklist predefined. Because if you don't know, then of course, certain things you need to figure out. But generally, like Wyatt said, year two, usually you need to then tweak the product market fit, and then you might think about putting more resources on the ground in sales. But then when you for sure go to scale, the end result should be a more or less self-sufficient team on the ground that sort of runs itself, has a regional VP, and you don't need to really babysit them anymore. Yeah.
Anything else to add for the panel? All right, let's give a round of applause. Thank you, everybody.
We're going to get that. It's 8:30.
Until 9, right?
We're good until 9.
Okay, so plan time to know if you have questions. You guys stay here just a second. Let me get something for you guys.
Pause for photos.
Yes. Oh yes, we need photos for DocuSign as well, so I forgot about that.
Will you have the socks in the photo?
Look at those sparkly ones.
Sparkly?
Okay, thank you.
¿Eso era el anterior?
Nice. Thank you very much.